Michael, thank you for making time to be here today.
Mike, I'm so delighted to be hanging out with you, as I always am. And the fact that we're recording this for people to listen to is just an added bonus.
Well, the fun thing about it is you and I will get together on Zoom every now and then and just riff back and forth about these topics. And it really is a conversation. And I think the intention I had today was for the listeners to basically sit in on one of our Zoom chats and hear a conversation about leadership. And what prompted me to want to reach out is, obviously you've had unbelievable success with The Coaching Habit. That book is in the last 100 years, the best-selling coaching book in the world.
It's like literally unbelievable. Like I can barely believe it. It's like so not expected, but it's fantastic. It really did kind of strike a chord 8 years ago and has just continues to kind of rocket along as a bestseller. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
One of the things that really struck me about that book is the fact that it's just full of powerful questions. And I know, for leaders, one of the challenges as you become a leader is to move away from the advice trap, right? And to move into a place of being thoughtful, curious, and actually listening deeply. And The Coaching Habit is full great questions to ask so that you're not in a problem-solving mindset, you're in a coaching mindset. And so with that anchoring and seeing that you had released your book, How to Work with, and I love the fact that it's in brackets, almost anyone.
Yeah, it's my best book title, I think, by far. As soon as I go, How to Work with Almost Anyone, everybody laughs because everybody gets who the almost is. And I'm sure we'll touch on
all have
that.
a person where they're like, I don't want to make this relationship.
No, exactly. Not that person.
No,
if you met that person, they're a nightmare. Yeah.
If you did, you'd know. And so what I love about the book is I thought, if you do for coaching, if you do for relationships, what you did for coaching, if you do for our most important relationships, what you did for coaching, that's a game changer that I think is potentially even bigger than The Coaching Habit.
Well, that's a high bar, but I mean, obviously I would aspire to that. But let me ask you, Mike, because the thing about The Coaching Habit, it's really clear what problem it's trying to fix, which is to unweird coaching, to make it feel accessible and doable by normal people so they can bring staying curious a little bit longer into the way they interact with their direct reports, sure, but also just the people around them, the people that they interact with. What do you think How to Work with Almost Anyone best unweirds? Because I've got some thoughts, like it could be it unweirds psychological safety. Because, Amy Edmondson for more than 10 years now has been teaching us about psychological safety, and most of us get it. Most of us are like, oh yeah, you need to make a place feel safe enough for people to speak up when things are going wrong or to show up as the full version of themselves. So it could be that. Or it could be around team working. And it's like, how do you make team working and team connections so that you get the best out of each other? Or maybe it's about collaboration. These are all kind of variations on a theme, but I'm curious to know if you had to kind of hang this book on a hook, say, this is the thing that it makes most easy. What do you think it is what problem does it solve?
What I thought it was before I read it was a book about how to make your working relationships better. That's what I thought this book was. And then I read it. And when I finished reading it, I had a global perspective. And I think that listening with curiosity, with the intent of building really solid relationships with the people that are closest to us, that are the most important to us, that's what this book is for. And I feel like if, every person on the planet had a copy of this book,
that would be a good day for me.
Well, it would. And I think it would be a good day for humanity.
Yeah.
Because what it would do is it would be, if all I did was build my best possible relationship with the small group of people that I consider my intimate circle, and I just did that, and then you did that, and then on and on and on, would fundamentally change society. And so that's what problem I think it's solving.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I appreciate the kind of wind in my sails around that. It's written to try and improve working relationships, because I find that, if I'm writing for a very specific person, that's a helpful kind of focus that the book might have. And this is a person, they're a mid-level manager, they need to work with their team, they need to work with their boss, they need to work with the collaborators and the other business units that they work with. They need to have better client relationships. And this is a way of helping people not be passive about just hoping that the good relationships come along, but to actually claim some agency and go, look, I can shape these working relationships so that they all nudge in the right direction towards becoming better. But it's also true, Mike, that when I write my books, I try and write them in more in an evergreen way rather than if you're not a manager, none of this will make any sense to you, so that it has a resonance beyond just that obvious work relationship. So I appreciate you seeing that potential in the book and sharing it.
I think that what I've noticed throughout my life is that the skills that I've learned about how to be a great leader, how to be in communication, how to solicit and give feedback, how to help to open up my blind spots, how to deal with conflict, how to have difficult conversations. They've made my working relationships so much better.
Right.
And they've made my marriage better. Yeah. And they've made me a better parent. And they've made me a better son and brother and uncle, father, friend. Like every role in my life has been improved. And so although, the intent of this book as you stated, I took it and I said, well, if you're able to do that at work and you get good at this, because as you say in the book, hey, it's going to take some courage. So maybe start with the easiest person that you can think of, right? And start with them, see if they're willing to go down this road of answering these questions, and then be authentic and answer the questions back to them. And that works well. Yeah. You can't help but take that and bring that back into your personal life. And so that's why I globalized it when I finished reading it.
As somebody who's done so much of this work yourself, what do you know now about building better relationships that you didn't know 5 years ago?
I can go back even more broadly than 5 years to say that intent matters a lot in conversation. If my intention is to be right over being happy, things aren't going to go well in this conversation.
Right.
If my intent is unclear in that I want to win this argument, or do I want to have fantastic long-term relationship with this person and I want to go do great things with them. So yay, I won the battle and lost the war.
Right.
And so I feel like that's been important. I think that being open to soliciting feedback from the people that care about me and deeply listening to the answers that they give me, because if it is a blind spot, it won't be obvious. It might trigger me and it may sting when I hear it.
Right. And it quite possibly will. It's not a maybe, it's a likely to. Yeah. You're like, how can you be saying that about me? Don't you understand? I'm like Desjardins. I'm like, this has to be wrong. You're like, oh, wait, it's a blind spot. I don't know what I don't know. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that my ego would be one of the things that gets in the way of me being in fantastic relationships. And so if I recognize that I can either choose my ego or I can choose the relationship, and if I choose the relationship and I trust the other person wants also the same outcome, and I know that their intent is to be in a great relationship with me, and I operate from that premise, it's just a different conversation. It's a different argument. Now, I'm still in ideological conflict with the people that I work with. I'm still in ideological conflict with my daughter and my wife. But what I'm not in with them is interpersonal conflict. And for listeners to just differentiate those two things, actually, Michael, why don't you differentiate for us the difference between interpersonal conflict and ideological conflict, and what your understanding is of the value of conflict?
Well, I would suspect that one is about a conflict around content, and the other is a conflict about values or dominance. And you can have a relationship that is less about I'm trying to dominate you or I'm trying to beat you, or I'm trying not to lose to you, versus look, we've also got to sort this out. Are we going to this restaurant or that restaurant later on for dinner tonight? So what you're making me reflect on is this is a very useful distinction, which is also appreciating the intent of the other person. Because as I heard you say, look, do I want to be right or do I want to be happy? Part of that stance comes from being the person who perhaps has the more power in the relationship. Like and like you and I are both, oldish, white, straight dudes. So we've kind of been dealt the right cards from the patriarchy and whatever else.
Absolutely.
So we're often in that position of like status or authority, or we're certainly more rarely in a position of being one down. We're more in the position of being one up. And it means that we're often better able to trade being right for being happy. And I just think it's worth acknowledging that for some people, actually being right is a process of creating boundaries and holding boundaries and not subsuming yourself or assuming that you're wrong or diminishing or denigrating yourself. And in dysfunctional relationships, that's what can be happening. But as you say, and I just wanted people to hear this, you also said, and if the intent of the other person is good as well, then you've got that kind of shared commitment to how do we build the best relationship we have, one that allows ideological conflict about you got this point of view, I've got this point of view, they're different. How do we resolve that? But less about I'm trying to prove that I'm the better person than you.
I love that you bring up boundaries because I think that people generally, I've heard a lot of people talk about boundaries as blockades to relationships. Like, oh, they put up a boundary. And my thought is, well, actually boundaries are the way that I can love me and love you and you can love me.
Right.
And I'm being very clear on the context and the container within which I want to be in relationship with you. And the boundary, because my other option is don't put up the boundary, just don't be in relationship with the person.
Right.
And I'd rather be able to express my boundaries, which say, I can love me and I can love you and you can love me with as long as this boundary is in place for me.
Yeah. And so what that means is it might be a barrier to relationship because it might be you going, look, this is not cool. This is my line here. And the other person goes, well, I'm going to transgress that. And at a certain point, you may go, look, the way I stop you transgressing this is by not being in relationship with you around it. Because we tried and this is kind of a bit crappy. But what it typically means in healthy loving relationships, working relationships as well, is we go, like, we understand each other's boundaries. That's what we do. And in fact, I'm not a licensed family therapist or even close to it, but I certainly spend a lot of time reading people like Esther Perel and Terry Real and Dan Siegel and the Gottmans, all these kind of giants who've been thinking about romantic relationships forever and have such wisdom about it. And I'm certainly kind of standing on the shoulders of giants as I think about what shows up and how to work with almost anyone. And a good deal of it is around, let me show you who I am, show me who you are, so we can actually see each other more clearly rather than making stuff up about each other. But as part of that as well, which is like, let me tell you what works and what doesn't work when you're working with me, so we can get more of the former and less of the latter.
More of the former and less of the latter. I think that the vulnerability that you just described of let me show you who I really am.
Yeah.
Right. That you show me who you really are. So that's a level of vulnerability. It's a level of psychological safety in the relationship. It's a level of authenticity. And I have some boundaries around being in a relationship. And these are the boundaries. And I'm expressing those boundaries to you because actually it takes a lot of courage to express a boundary to another person. Yeah. I'm expressing them because I want a better relationship with you. That's why I'm expressing my boundaries. And if a person is to receive it that way, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, you're expressing a boundary because you want to be in relationship with me. Because your other option was don't express it, in which case you could either build up resentment, that's an option, or you could retract from the relationship and spend less time with me. I don't want that. Yeah. So I feel like these are the building blocks of great relationships. I feel like your book has armed people with the practical questions that they can ask people.
I mean, adjacent to that, like as a quick summary of the book for folks, because we've kind of plunged right in.
Right, let's do that.
The insight is our working relationships have a huge influence on our happiness and our success. And most of us are pretty passive about them rather than active about trying to make them better. I think you can make almost all of your working relationships better. You're striving for a best possible relationship that is safe and vital, meaning alive and repairable. And the way that you get towards those three pillars is the keystone conversation, which are 5 questions you ask and answer. And I'm summarizing all that, Mike, because I want to say, this exchange of information, this vulnerability is an act of service to the other person. And the very first question is the amplify question, which is what's your best? Should you shine and when do you flow? And I know because I've done this exercise with, thousands of people now, that there's some people who are like, oh, I know how to answer that question and I can't wait to kick off on it. They're all up for it. But there's a lot of people for whom that question feels a bit weird and awkward, not least because it's like, I don't really like to boast. I don't really like to self-aggrandize myself. this feels like I'm becoming a blowhard. And I would say you are sharing this information in service of the other person and in service of the relationship you're seeking to build with them. Because if Mike, you and I are working together, and Mike, you come to me and go, let me tell you what I'm like at my best. Let me tell you when I shine and flow. I'm like, that's only useful information for me. It gives me every chance of getting more of that Mike showing up. It stops a bunch of things I just had made up about you, because that's what we do. We make stuff up about that other person. And it means that I've got understanding about, so how do I set this up so I get the very best of Mike? Because if I got the very best of Mike, Mike is happy and I'm happy and the relationship happy and the work's probably better. So it's not so much of a, let me just show you how big my ego is. It's like, look, let me just show you the controls. Let me show you some of the buttons. Let me show you the strengths I have, so we can play to those.
I think the work of Marcus Buckingham in the original Strength Finders work spoke to that, which said that the work of trying to figure out what you're strong at is the work of then spending most of your time in that place. And then his recommendation when you're done Strength Finders is to say, well, tell other people and describe to them what your strengths are. Why? Because they're in a working relationship with you and they want to be able to understand what your strengths are, so they can set up meetings, they can set up projects and invite you to collaborate with them in areas where they might not be strong.
Exactly. Now, that first question, I went through a range of different options, and one of them was, what are your strengths? And in the end, I said, that is, not as useful a question as what's your best. Because when I ask people what their strengths are, particularly if they've taken Strength Finder, they're like, if they can remember, they're like, let me give you my 5 top strengths. And they're like, it's strategist, it's woo, it's creativity. And I was like, well, that's good, but I don't really know what any of those mean. It doesn't tell me that much about how I work with you. I was like, oh yeah, okay, good. I've got the vibe, but I don't really know. Whereas if I go, tell me when you shine, tell me when you flow, tell me the work you do, tell me the way you work with people, tell me your own preferences about what really lights you up, then I get to really understand this is what best of looks like and feels like and how it appears in the world.
It's interesting. We use a phrase in the company at Virtus, which is, what do you rely on me for? And it's fascinating to hear what other people see as our best. They are relying on us in relationship with them, or it could be in our role in the organization, to be able to deliver something consistently that they value. And what I love about this is you're flipping the script and you're saying, no, but what do you think is your best? Like, when do you feel your best? Because as brought up in Strength Finders, one of the challenges with a strength is that a strength is something that you're good at and adds energy to your life.
That's it.
And a weakness is something you're good at and detracts energy from your life.
Right.
And so if you ask other people, they may say, well, I rely on you for this, and I think this is your strength.
Exactly.
I hate doing that. I know I'm good at it, but I really don't like doing it. And what I love about your question is it's from my perspective. Like, what do I think when am I at my best, and when do I feel at my best, which takes both the strengths concept, but also the energetic piece of it and blends that together.
Yeah, I love that you've picked up on that, because one of the exercises in the book, the book has these 5 questions, and against each of the 5 questions, there are 3 exercises you can kind of work through to become more articulate and more nuanced and more granular about who you are and how you show up. And one of them addresses that very tension that you've just put your finger on, Mike, which is looking at what you do and mapping it on a 2x2 matrix. So anybody who's ever met a consultant in the last 40 years knows what one of those are. But if you don't know, it's a box with a cross in the middle. So you've got four squares within a big square. And along the bottom axis, you have good at, plus and minus. And on the vertical axis, you have fulfilled by, plus and minus. And then you kind of just map how you spend your time, or how you might be spending your time against that, and kind of put different tasks and different roles and different obligations into different boxes. And what you hope is you have a whole bunch of stuff in the top quadrant, top right-hand quadrant, which is I am fulfilled by this and I am good at this. So that is a classic strength in terms of the way Marcus Buckingham would say it. It's like I'm competent at it and it gives me energy. Yay. What you hope is you got nothing in the bottom left-hand box, because that is I'm not good at it and I'm not fulfilled by it. So it means you suck at this and you also suck at it and it also sucks you dry. So you're like, if you've got anything there, that's bad for everybody. Nobody's winning by you having anything in that box. But then what's interesting is this conversation between the plus minus combinations. One of the plus minus combinations is I am good at this and I am not fulfilled by it. So that is what Buckingham calls a weakness, which is like, I'm perfectly competent at it, but honestly, I'm now old enough and ugly enough that this is not a joyous experience for me anymore, So it opens up a conversation, which is like, look, I could be the backup, I could be the coach, I could be the guardrails, I could be the check-in. But if you make this the core of what I do, there's a price that gets paid by everybody. And then the final box that remains, the plus minus combination, is I am fulfilled by this, but not good at it. Or I am fulfilled by this, but not yet good at it. And, normally we don't want to share the stuff that we're not yet good at. But when you realize that this is kind of your future development, your future pathway, this is what lights you up. You're like, so what you want is, I want this, but don't leave me unsupervised. Like, I don't know enough to do this without some coaching, some training, some check-ins, some safety nets, whatever it is. And if you can have that conversation with people, like, for instance, Mike, you and I have similar pathways, right down to the fact that we're both sitting here wearing identical black T-shirts on this thing. I'm like, we're kind of clones. You've got better hair than I do. I've got a better mustache than you have.
And it's fantastic glasses for this.
There we go. You can look at my pathway and go, look, Michael started 2 or 3 little companies. You could have an assumption that Michael is a decent CEO. Here's the thing. I am not that good at being a CEO, and I am definitely not very fulfilled at being a CEO. Even though I've done it, and even though you can make up a story about Michael knows what he's doing, let me tell you, Michael does not know what he's doing, and Michael isn't interested in learning what he's doing. I mean, if you and I got together and we just started chatting and we made plans to collaborate or do something fun, you can make all sorts of assumptions based on show up with a reputation, and you show up with a reputation. And what this conversation is doing is going, let me discard my reputation or whatever it is that you've made up about me. And let me tell you what really makes me move and what really is sand in my gears.
I love that because, as you said earlier, we're story making machines as human beings, right? Like we have, this comment about you can't assume things. We have to assume things, right? Like we're driving down the street. I'm assuming that everybody's going to, use the rules of the road the same way I am. And it isn't going to become complete chaos as we're driving. So we fill in all these gaps. And sometimes when we fill in these gaps with stories, they don't serve us very well because we made it up.
Yeah.
Now, you telling me what fulfills you, lights you up, and what you're strong at, there's no story I need to make up there. You've given me the information. I now have that. And whatever stories I had about you coming in, I parked those now. I'm like, oh, those aren't true. Okay, that's good. So I don't need to think about those things anymore. I now know what's true for Michael.
Exactly.
So once we've grounded in having that shared understanding, because this isn't, when you go into this conversation, isn't like, okay, I'm going to ask the other person, they're going to tell me, and then we're going to move to the next question.
Yeah.
This is a conversation where we're both sharing.
Yeah, it's a give and a take.
And what we're best at. So once we have that grounding of what we're best at, where do we go next?
Yeah, well, there are 5 questions. So one of your options is to move through all 5 of the questions, and you could certainly do that, but you don't have to. And I say that because, one of the conversations I regularly have with this is, man, this feels hard and it feels risky and it feels dangerous and it feels weird. And I'm like, you don't really have these type of conversations. And I think that's partially true. I'm not sure it's weird. I think what's weird is sitting with dysfunctional relationships and then not doing anything about them. But there's no doubt that this is a somewhat awkward conversation. So if you want to kind of do the whole work and have the deep conversation, and it's the right person and you're the right person and it's the right time, you can move on perhaps to the next question, which I'll share in a minute. But just to acknowledge, there are some conversations you might be having with people and you're like, you know what? There's something at risk here. I don't want to be super vulnerable. I don't want to lie on the therapy couch and reveal all, because I don't know how that's going to go. And so you might say, look, your work is done. You've had an initial conversation. You've shared the best of who you are. You might want to leave it at that, because there are 2 great outcomes from having this keystone conversation, this conversation about how we work together before we get into the what of the work. One is the immediate answers you get, but more subtly and more long-term is an ongoing permission to keep talking about the health of the relationship. So the fact that you've had the first conversation about one of the questions means that there's an opportunity to come back and have another conversation. How are we doing? How about this question? What do we want to share now? But let's say you're plunging on and you're like, great, we've had a good exchange, give and take around the first question, what's your best? The second question is the process question, and it's a steady question. And the question is, what are your I forgot my own question. I think it's what are your processes and preferences?
Yes.
Or preferences and processes. I can't remember the order I wrote it in. And this is simply to kind of go, let's have a conversation about the mechanics of how we work, because our mechanics feel natural and intuitive and obvious to us. But in fact, they're a little more obscure to other people. So for instance, we've got Mike on the other mic. Now, he is showing up as Mike. I show up as Michael. I don't like to be called Mike. There are 3 people in this world who call me Mike. Actually, there are 7 people in this world who call me Mike, who are my brothers, their wives, and their kids. That's it. That's the entire universe of people who I want to call me Mike. Everybody else, I'm Michael. Or I'm MBS if you have to. And then I've got a surname, Bungay Stanier. Now, my surname is actually Bungay Stanier, but there's no hyphen there. And it freaks people out how long that name is. And, people are always anxious about writing it down. People misspell it all the time. Got a letter once addressed to Michael Banging Spaniel as a particularly outstanding way.
That's
Mike,
the height of it.
You've also got a surname that is more complicated than, say, Smith.
Yes.
So, you may go, look, here's how you say my name. You don't put a weird French accent on it. It's not
depending where I am in the world.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is just a very, very simple example, but it is a stone in my shoe when somebody just starts calling me Mike. Because if I miss it the first time, then it starts getting weird and awkward in terms of me going, you know how you've been calling me Mike now for 4.5 years? I have never liked that. Right. So you can have this conversation about, morning person, evening person, technologies you use, pronouns, what good meetings look like, what good feedback looks like. There's a bunch of stuff here you can exchange around just the logistics and the mechanics of how you work together. And getting that stuff wrong rarely causes a dramatic breakdown, but it does rip the fabric. And this is a way of ensuring that you avoid, basically a bit of a rookie mistake.
I think that it's kindness too to have that conversation, right? It's if I'm to be in a relationship with you, I want to know your preference on your name, on your pronouns, on your preference of morning versus afternoons. And when I find out into a relationship that someone has a preference I didn't know about, a lot of the times I'm like, that's fine. I would have happily done that. I'm glad you told me. And I wish I would have known. That's great. And because most of the time it's not something that's arduous or difficult to imagine coming up with a solution to. I mean, if you said to me, hey, I'm a morning person, and I said to you, I work best late at night.
Right.
Okay, we might be challenged to find some times.
We can go, okay, so how do we work around that?
Yeah.
But what you're doing is you're just disrupting the default going, I think your settings are the same as my settings. And, sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. You're going to find out which ones are which.
I love that. I love that because it honors, I just don't know this about you. And it's something simple. And now you've shared it. And now I understand the container within which you operate. Like I always think of boundaries in general or constraints as a way to amplify creativity. Yeah. And so when you've told me your constraints, I like to work this way. I prefer being on the phone versus being on Zoom. And like, okay, cool. So that's the constraints. Okay, now I can be creative within those constraints. So you like to be on the phone, you don't like to be on Zoom. We can still use Miro to collaborate as a whiteboard, and we don't have to have the video on. So that still works, right? Yeah, that works great. Okay, perfect. Well, it basically creates a lot of opportunity when I think some people would say, well, if somebody's telling me about their constraints, well, that's just telling me it makes it harder to work with them. It's like, no, actually, it makes it way easier to work with them when I know this information.
And it's also fair to say that just because somebody tells you their preferences, you don't have to say yes to their preferences.
Right.
At the heart of some of this work, Mike, is, this is therapy language, but what I would say is building adult to adult relationships. And one of the definitions of that I like is an adult to adult relationship is asking for what you want, knowing that the answer may be no, and being able to negotiate the differences.
Right.
And so when you go, look, my preference is I don't do any work and you don't call me at all, but you just send me chocolate eclairs every Monday. I'm like, that's awesome. But, I don't think we're going to be able to do that and have me pay you a salary. So You get to kind of negotiate that if you need to.
When Sabrina, my wife, and I first met, she, after probably 4 or 5 dates, she said to me, "Why do you talk like that?" And I said,
I wanted to ask that question too.
"Yeah."
Do you talk like this, Mike? It's confusing for everybody.
And I said, "Well, I'm not talking in any particular way. This is just how I talk." And she's like, "Well, it's not normal." She said, "You're very specific." She's like, "I'm not saying you're inarticulate. You're very articulate, but you're very specific in the language that you choose and the types of questions that you ask." And I said, "Well, this is the work I do. Like, this is what I read. This is what I study. The people that I work with day to day, this is how they talk.
Yeah,
This is how we teach leaders to talk." And she said, "Well, it's weird."
it's weird.
And I said, I get
It's a
that.
good thing that it's a good thing you're sexy, because if it was relying on conversations, like I am
That's
loving
all I
you
had to rely on.
just for your physical presence.
Well, the funny thing was, so fast forward a year later, and Sabrina came home from dinner with one of her close girlfriends who was having some challenges, and she walked me through the conversation. It took about half an hour, and she walked me through, this is what I was saying. These are the kind of questions that I asked. And when she finished, I started laughing. And she's like, "Why is that funny?" I'm like, "No, it's not funny. It's just you sound like me now."
Yeah.
And so
I've had a similar conversation with my wife, who's like, the starting point was like, if I ever catch you coaching me, you are dead. Like, I will literally kill you in the middle of the night if I'm being coached by whoever you think you are. And I'm like, that's totally fine. But now she is a great listener and a support and really coach-like to a number of her relationships. And I'm like, I love it when a plan comes together.
Well, and I think the reason I brought this up is I wanted to underscore the fact that both people having the book in advance will increase psychological safety.
Agreed.
It'll make the conversation easier. It'll feel less weird because I also know what you're doing. So if you're planning,
and Mike's not just saying that to help me with book sales.
Yeah, you're going to sell
that will
2
also
books
help me
for
with
every
book
book
sales.
now. But no, I think I read the book and I thought, I could do this with Sabrina. I can do this with the people I work with. But if I wasn't me and this isn't what I did all day and the people around me weren't schooled in this, where would I start? I'm like, well, I need 2 copies like right away. Because the first person I'm going to do this with, I'm going to say, "Hey, could you at least just scan through this book? You don't have to read it in detail, but at least have a working knowledge of this book.
Yeah.
I'd like to have this conversation with you. I picked you because you're the safest person I could think of to have this conversation with. And I want to try this out. And I'm wondering if you're open to doing this with me." Of course, you can obviously say no if it's not something you want to do. But the purpose of me asking to do this with you is that I truly value our relationship and I would love to improve our relationship and continue to grow it. And I feel like this is the best tool that I found to do that. So I bought me a copy, and I'm wondering if you're willing to have this conversation with me.
Yeah. This is shooting myself in the foot, but what I agree with is the principle you're stating to, which is like, give the other person a chance to know what they're stepping into and to prepare. You don't actually need to buy the book to do that. You can go to bestpossiblerelationship.com and download the questions and just send them the questions.
Sure.
Send them to this conversation and listen to the podcast and go, this might be easier. But there's no doubt that the more they know about the process, the better they know the questions, whether they've done a few of the exercises or not. So each one of the 5 questions has 3 exercises associated with it, just to help you become more articulate and more granular and more specific and more precise around your language. And the more you've done that work, the better you're able to kind of like articulate exactly who you are. So in some ways, it's like a self-help book wrapped in a business book. And you're saying as much, Mike, when you say this is just good for people in general in relationship. But it's not self-help, it's us help. It's an us help book wrapped in a business book.
It is. And I think, as human beings, we're wired for connection.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you fell out with your tribe, 100,000 years ago, you're done.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's in our DNA to be wired to build great relationships.
Yeah.
And this feels like a manual and a how-to manual for doing that. I've read, I don't know how many as you have read every self-help, psychology book out there that I can get my hands on. And a lot of them they're steeped in theory. Yeah. They're very complex. They can explain to you things like an existential crisis. If you really knew me, you wouldn't love me. And so that's why I have to have a facade and I can't be authentic and vulnerable. And it's like, okay, I know that. Now what?
Yeah.
And what I love about your book is you're like, great, these things are all true. And here's all the people that you've tapped into and people that you admire, that you've read and listened to. Here's the practical skills. Here's how you actually go build better relationships in your working life. And you can do it in any area of your life. But this is the manual. And just as you did with the coaching habit and you demystified coaching, you don't need to go spend a year and a half getting a coaching certificate. If you want to be a better leader in an organization and move from a problem solving, which really doesn't grow anyone, to a coaching where I'm growing and creating other great leaders, and read the coaching habit, use these questions, follow this process. It's very straightforward and it works. I feel like you've done the same thing here and gone more broadly to say, if you want to improve the relationships that matter to you most, here's the starting point. Now, I happen to have built a relationship over time with your publisher at Page Two, Jesse. And so a
West Coast native like you.
Right. And I am going to reach out to Jesse and suggest that she shrink wrap your books in sets of 2 from now on. Because
that's a good idea.
I feel like it's a book that you got to buy it and then buy it for the person that you want to do this with. That's the starting point. And we've talked a lot about weirdness, right? Like, well, there's weird language, there's uncomfortable. And I think, when we're teaching people how to have a difficult conversation and they prepare thoughtfully for a difficult conversation, and then they go have it and we say, was it difficult? No, actually it wasn't.
Yeah.
Do you think other conversations of similar context will be difficult in the future?
Yeah.
No, but you thought it was a difficult conversation going into it. Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like with this book, it may feel that way at first, which is, okay, I got to put myself in, a little bit of courage here and test out the safety of my relationship. And after I've done this once, almost
it gets easier.
Yeah, it gets easier, right? And I think if you've got a partner in it, and the other person has a copy of your book, and just for our listeners, I don't get any royalties off of doubling Michael's book sales. God, I went and did it.
I know.
I don't get royalties off doubling Michael's book sales, but the key is, I think, if both people have it and both people are committed to this conversation, that's a great starting point. If both people don't have it, as you said, go to your website, mbs.works, and we'll put that in the show notes, and download a copy of the questions.
Yeah.
And even if they don't have a copy of the questions, just starting with a statement of, you're important to me. I picked you because it feels safe. I'd really like to have this conversation with you. You don't have to do any work. I'm going to guide it. I got this book. If you're interested, I got your copy as well. And would you be open to starting this conversation with me? I think that's the framing that I would use, having read this book.
I should be sending you out on podcast interviews on my behalf, because you're better at this than I am. bestpossiblerelationship.com. You can download the questions. We've designed them in kind of nice little ways, so you can, if you like to stick it up on your monitor or on your desk or whatever. There's also a video of me having a keystone conversation with Ainsley, who I work with.
Yeah.
And she got promoted to a new role, and so we were resetting our expectations with each other in that new role. So you can kind of see what that looks like, because sometimes the role modeling can really just help you relax into it. But Mike, I really like what you're saying, which is like, this does feel difficult the first time you do it, because everything feels difficult the first time you do it. And it is an opportunity to be a little more vulnerable, ask and be a little more curious. And those are also acts of slight vulnerability as well. But the more you do it, the just more second nature this becomes. Like after we finish this conversation, I'm having a conversation with a designer. I don't think the designer you introduced me to, Mike, but somebody else. And I'll have a conversation. I'm like, let me tell you when I've worked with vendors and freelancers and they've been really good and I've kept using them. Let me tell you what that relationship looked like. Let me tell you what it looks like when I've kind of like used them once and then wrapped up my relationship with them. Let me tell you what that looks like. Do you think that's going to be helpful for this person? Yes. And if they tell me, let me tell you my best clients, what they look like and what they do. Let me tell you about the clients that actually are pretty irritating, what they do. Is that going to be helpful for me? Absolutely. So this exchange of information is in service of the other person and in service of your joint ambitions together.
If you're listening to this conversation and you're thinking to yourself, that sounds like a lot of work to go have that conversation with all the people in my life, I would implore you to pick up a copy of the book and have it with just one person. Just one person. That's it. And see how that goes and see how that feels. And if it works for you and you feel comfortable and it feels a little bit less weird as you're going through it, and it probably will, right?
Yeah.
Then maybe you'll decide to have it with a second person. And if all of us decided to put that kind of energy into the most important relationships to us, I think that would fundamentally help to change the course of dialogue across the world. I'm so grateful to have been in conversation with you, Michael. I really appreciate you making time to have this conversation, to walk us through the book, to share the wisdom that you've garnered. You put so much thought and heart into the work you do and into putting this on paper. And I know it's not easy to craft something like this. So thank you so much for your time. And thanks for being here today.
You. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for the conversation. I knew this was going to be good, and it was.
If you're curious to find out more about Michael Bungay Stanier, his company, The Box of Crayons, he's also a keynote speaker. If you're interested in his books, I'm going to have all the links posted in the show notes below. Any links that we mentioned will also be in the show notes. So feel free to check that out. Thanks for listening. All right, we're stopping. How was that for you?